PhD&D on YouTube. This is world building, video number 3, I believe, talking about life. We have established the creators of the world. We've defined them. We've defined the beginnings of this world, and now it is time for life to come into play. So, this discussion will be about races, about what is inhabiting this world that you're creating. What life exists? Just questions to ponder before you do anything. What life exists in your world? Why does it exist? How does it exist? Now, how did this life arise in your world? How did it, did the gods or the primordials breathe life into the world? Was there a natural course, perhaps, of evolution from the elements the gods put forth that led to life in your world? Questions to ponder. Questions to, maybe they don't need an exact definitive answer or, definition, but they can inspire you to come to the conclusions of the life you wish to have in your world. Why? Not only how did this life arise, but why? Was there a purpose? Did evolution happen moving ever in the direction of survival to create the beings that inhabit your world? Did the gods have a purpose for certain types of life? As we talked in the previous video on the creators, did they want slaves? Did they want worshipers? Why is this life here? Just something to ponder, something to know. Once again, doesn't have to be completely fleshed out, but it can inspire you in how to define these life forms. Number 1, think about civilized races. What civilized races are going to exist? This includes doesn't have to include all of, races that players in your game can actively play as. They can, are they going to be able to play as one of these races, all of these races, some of them? But what civilized races exist? I usually say to stick with about 7 to 10 initially, regardless of how you're doing this. And I also say to, especially if you're just beginning world building, definitely steal from whichever system you're using, because once again, building races can be very time consuming. Coming up with your own races can be extremely time consuming. And feel free to steal. There's ready-made races out there, just like in the last video I said there's ready-made gods. Steal them. And a good point someone made in the comments on that last video, not only steal them, but then take those and make them into what you want. Tweak them a little bit. If you don't like how the elf is presented, tweak it. You can do whatever you want, because again, this system will become, or this world will become, part of your gaming system, part of your mind, your imagination. It will not be, whatever you stole it from when it's all said and done. So, I'll give you an example. Elves, in my game, I did a little differently. I stole, in my biggest ongoing campaign right now, it is based off of the Dungeons and Dragons, races, gods, everything like that. And I didn't like how elves were presented. First of all, I'm intrigued by the Eladrin race. I know some people aren't. It intrigues me. I didn't like how elves kind of fit into the mix. So in my game, they've become a very, very hostile race. Elves are, first of all, you don't see them much. They're almost like an extinct species. You see them that little. And they're very hostile. They, if you intrude into their territory without, with any sign of a threat, they're going to come after you and try to kill you. That's how it is. And I know elves are seen very differently by many people. Even the typical D&D elf is not that type. But that's what I wanted to have in my campaign, and that's the role that I had at Phil. So, once again, steal if you're just beginning to get a lot of that work done for you. Steal races from the typical ones, but then tweak them to make them your own at the same time. Think of the beginnings of each of these races, just briefly. These are not things you need to sit down and write, long journals about, but think about the beginnings and how the beginnings influence the culture, because that's going to come into play. What was the beginning of this elf race? Why is that race so hostile in my game? And what happened to them to get them so secluded from society? It's a matter of their very beginnings and their early interactions with other races, and I won't go into it, but in my game it has a lot to do with their relationship with Eladrin as well. So think back to those beginnings. How will that influence the current culture that they have now? If you take a race that's already made, like dwarves, and their beginning is completely different than how, say, D&D has dwarves from the beginning, that's something you need to know, because it's going to change them drastically. If you're going to keep the same beginnings, that's fine. Once again, the work is already done for you there. So how do these races interact as well? How do elves and dwarves interact? Do they love each other? Is it the typical they hate each other? Or is it something different? Think about each of the races in your game, and I'm going to go with some common D&D races just to keep it simple that most people have heard of. You've got, elves, dwarves, let's say dragonborn, humans. How are these interacting with one another? Do they specifically despise a certain race? Do they specifically love another race? Especially if it's something different than the preset notions, you need to be aware of it, because if you're going to tweak it enough, you need to know how that's going to affect other parts of their culture. And then just being aware of their histories, their traits, things like that. Are tieflings always extremely rude? Are they don't get along with anyone, is what I mean. Obviously you can have rude people, nice people. But do tieflings just despise all other races? Are they very scholarly? Are they very secluded from society? Just be aware of these traits of their culture as a whole, and once again, it may not fit with every single individual, but with the culture as a whole, it gives you an idea. Now, I'm going to use the term monsters for the next section. I don't like to, but I believe it'll be easiest for you to pick up on. What monsters exist in the world? And by that I mean, what other creatures are filling this world besides civilized races with all the cities, with established forms of government, things like that? What other creatures are inhabiting this world? What are your characters going to come into contact with in the wild, in dungeons, under mountains, on top of mountains? Just what's out there. Have the general idea of what you're going to have or what you're not going to have. If you don't want goblins, don't have goblins. It's as simple as that. But just know if you're going to include something out of the ordinary, or get rid of something that is normally there. What creatures are awaiting in the darkest places of the world? What is, if you can find the extreme, what is the darkest, scariest type of creature? What are there things like in D&D, things that come to mind would be like mind flayers immediately, or illithids who they're creepy, you don't want to go near them. They're stuff of legend almost. What are the creatures in the darkest places of the world? What creatures are pure evil at their core? What are creatures that no matter which one you run into, it's evil, it's going to try to kill you, it's going to try to manipulate you? What are just the most evil of creatures? Just, again, questions to ask to kind of get the brainstorming going, give you an idea of fleshing out your world and the life within it. And once again, what inhabits the wild? Think about, life maybe that there's not even a lot of interaction with, but are there animals are there rabbits, squirrels, foxes? Are none of those, nothing from the real world? Maybe you want 100% fantasy. But just know that. Know if you're going to have, foxes running through the woods, or birds up in the air, or maybe it's something completely, once again, fantasy flying through the air, and there's no such thing as birds even. Maybe they're, miniature, minuscule. They look like dragons. Just little tiny, the size of birds, but look like dragons. But what inhabits the wild that's maybe not threatening? A lot of people don't think about that. They think immediately to the threats and don't even concern themselves with a lot of creatures that can really bring in a good narrative in a world. So, how do these species interact with the civilized? First of all, the monsters, the ones that may be a little more hostile, maybe not always. Maybe orcs get along really well with a certain race and despise all others. Just think about the interactions there. What about the wild animals? What about these little tiny flying dragons that fill the sky? Are they just like birds and just go about their business? Or do they sometimes wreak havoc? Can they, do they have a breath weapon, if you will, or do they breathe fire or something else? Or maybe they're extremely good. Maybe these are little water dragons who they fly around and basically water plants, water plant life. When swarms of them come through, it's like a rainstorm. Just things like that can really make your world stand out. Think about it. Think about how they interact, because that's going to happen. There's interaction. That's what makes it interesting. So just things to ponder again. Where do they live, these monsters, these creatures? Where are they? Underground? Are they above ground? In the woods? In the plains? Once again, just have a general idea here. Jot some notes down in your notebook. I like to just put, different races, different ideas. Let's say are miniature flying water dragons. I'll write that exact thing down. And they live by the coast. They migrate from the east coast to the west coast, and back and forth maybe twice a year, bringing this rainstorm with them. Just have little notes like that. Once again, they just add to the world, flesh out that world. Ancient interactions is something else to consider. Among the races that have been around since the dawn of time, what were their interactions like? How did goblins and dwarves get along near the beginning of both of their cultures? Because that will influence into the future everything that they're doing. So just think about those ancient interactions between the oldest of the old. Maybe dwarves and elves really do hate each other, but it's because that's how they were brought up. There's nothing specifically that they can pinpoint about the other race other than that's how it's always been. Something to think about. And I want to finish with a technique that's going to come into play more so now as you're moving on into the next steps of your world building, and that is what I like to call the ripple effect. The ripple effect, and it's here that we begin to see the first drops of this ripple effect. Some of you mentioned it without even knowing it probably. On the comments of the last video, you said you don't create your gods, you let the players kind of flesh it out. You give them, you have your players, you let them kind of influence the past and bring it about that way, which is great, and that is what this is about. The ripple effect, basically the seeds planted for life, will ripple out like a drop on water. If you've ever seen, raindrop hitting water, it will ripple out. Make it more centered here. Ripple out. And it ripples both forward into the future and then back to the beginning of time. Now, before I get too deep here with this, I'll explain it to you. You must not only look back, but you must reflect back. You've established perhaps the creators of your world. You've established what they were like, and you've moved forward to life here. Let's say you're going along with me. Now we're at the life stage. Do not have those gods in the past set in stone by any means. You come up with something in this phase where you're coming up with the life. Let it ripple back. Let it come back into time and affect the gods. Maybe, once again, you're creating this world how you want it. You're not going to come up with everything you want about the gods, within a day or two of just working strictly on them. You may come up with a great idea that was inspired by one of your races. Maybe now I'm going to add a god for these tiny little water dragons, or something to do with them, but I didn't come up with them until now. I'm going to let that ripple back and affect that. Now I'm going to add another god to the world and see how that brings things into the future. But also, you can't just look forward, you need to change the future as well. If you've got these types of life established, these are the types of life in your world, how are they going to affect the future? What's the world going to look like because you've chosen these races, these monsters, these creatures to exist? Because your life looks like this. What will the world look like in the future when you're ready to play your game? It's the ripple effect that goes forward and backward. You're always changing the past. You're always changing the future. That is world building at its finest right there. Organic world building from start to finish is wonderful. I've talked about how I like organic versus the layering of world building. Organic from start to finish. Let the beginnings influence the world creation. Start with ideas. Let them work themselves out how they would. That is organic world building. But you can make it even better. The step better is the ripple effect. It is because the greatest worlds, from both organic logic, meaning how a world would organically form, but also mixed with your imagination. Because you finished the gods, 2 weeks ago, that doesn't mean you can't add something to it. Always be working both ways. You're never, once again, if you go strictly in that organic mindset, you can fall into the trap of layering, gods, life, cities, etc., etc. No, always be working on everything. Just picture raindrops in a puddle. Once you do one thing, it's going everywhere else and changing it like that. A lot of little rambling there going on, so I apologize, but that is the ripple effect. Don't just be working on one thing. Let what you're working on now influence something else. That's going to create the best world for you. That is the world building lesson on life in your campaign. The more advanced world building video upon life will cover more topics of if you'd like to create a race, if you'd like to create some form of life from scratch. So look forward to that. That will be in the advanced series following my world building series. Thank you very much for watching, and please post if you have any questions, comments, responses, whatever. More than happy to help answer those. Thanks again.